Welcome, everyone. I think I know most of you here, but for those of you who I don't know, especially we have some friends of Terry, I think a former roommate, and maybe some relatives. So we're delighted to welcome some new friends to the National Committee. I'm Jan Barris, I'm the Vice President, and we're really just delighted to have all of you, but especially to have an old friend of the National Committee, Terry Lautz, here with us today. You all have his very brief bio on the back of this. It does tell you that Terry is a director of the National Committee, which we are very proud of, and he's always one of those board members that you can turn to whenever you need some help and advice. And Terry is also on an advisory committee for us for our Public Intellectuals program, which he actually was one of the original sort of founding advisors and very early supporters of when he was during some of the many years that he was at the Luce Foundation, and we're very grateful to him for his help on that as well. But what it doesn't tell you on here is that Terry actually, his connection with the committee goes back all over 42 years ago, when the National Committees, which had been started, our foundation really started on the basis of public education back in 1966. For those of you who might not know, see the 50 on your card here, we're celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. And in 1966, when we first began, up until 1972, our sole focus was on public education. But in 1972, when we brought the Chinese ping pong team over to the United States and were very involved in ping pong diplomacy, we began working on exchanges with China and felt there was sort of a basic conflict between being honest and full of integrity on our programs that we were doing, our education programs, and the needs that we would have when we were doing exchanges with China. So our board decided that we would hive off our public education programs. We looked around to find an institution and people to whom we might entrust those education activities, and it turned out it went to the China Council of the Asia Society, which Terry and two other colleagues helped reinvigorate, and we gave them not just our programs and our funding that went along with those programs, and our staff member at the time, Peggy Blumenthal, who's sitting up here in the front row. So it was really quite an investment, and Peggy and Bob Oxnam and Richard Bush and Terry Lautz sort of took our programs and ran with them, and we're very pleased with your conservatorship of those. And actually not conservatorship, because that implies sort of a static thing, but your active involvement to take our programs beyond what we had done. But Terry has also, as I indicated, kept the relationship with the National Committee going over these years. So we're very pleased to be able to have him here tonight to talk about a really interesting book that he's written, John Birch, A Life. I see a lot of people in the audience who has hair the same color as mine, who have hair the same color as mine. So I know all of you at least know the name John Birch. What you might not know is the man behind that name, and that's what Terry has written about so interestingly in this book. He's going to start talking basically about the book. We just did a podcast that talks more about the making of the book and the impetus for it and the challenges that he had to overcome. So we'll see where we get tonight in terms of the content part, and if we don't reach that, you can all listen to the podcast. But if we have time, we can talk about that a little bit as well. So why don't we start?
All right, Jen, thanks so much. It's really wonderful to be with all of you. Happy Chinese New Year, happy Year of the Monkey. And Jan may not recall, but one of my early connections with the National Committee, and I do want to offer my congratulations on the 50th anniversary of this distinguished organization that's worked for so long and so hard to promote better understanding of China. But one of my earliest direct experiences was being asked to escort a delegation of National Committee members to China This was in December of 1978. I had spent time in Taiwan and Hong Kong, but I had never been to the mainland, and so this was my first opportunity. And it came right on, literally on the eve of normalization of U.S.-China diplomatic relations. And so it was an exciting time to be there. But I am forever grateful to the National Committee to have served as the escort and as the baggage counter, baggage handler, and so forth. It was a wonderful experience that stays with me to this day. So for those of you who might have been around in the 1960s here in the United States, you probably will recall the name of the John Birch Society. There was a folk song group called the Chad Mitchell Trio, and they wrote a very lively, kind of rollicking satire of the Birch Society in the early 60s. I was in high school at the time. And there were some memorable lines. Yeah, one was, socialism is the ism dismalest of all. And there was another one saying that, members of the Birch Society, if your mommy is a commie, then you gotta turn her in. But there was another line that always kind of stuck in the back of my mind, and that was, we only hail the hero from whom we got our name. We're not sure what he did, but he's our hero just the same. And I was always curious that suggested to me that there was some difference between the John Birch Society and John Birch, the man, but I never was quite curious enough to figure that out until I stumbled on this project about 5 years ago when I was doing research at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington. And Jan and I have just had a conversation about how all of that evolved. But what I'd like to do in the next 20 minutes or so is just give you an overview of the book and draw on a few quotes from a few passages in the book. As I've already suggested, of course, Bob Dylan also had Talkin' John Birch, Paranoid Blues, if you remember that one. Censored by the executives at CBS and not allowed to appear on the Ed Sullivan Show at the time. But lots and lots of people knew that the Birch Society was kind of right-wing extremists. If you were around at that point, you may have also seen billboards around the country advocating for the impeachment of Chief Justice Earl Warren. Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Earl Warren. Or you may have seen billboards about getting the United States out of the United Nations. But what made the Birch Society notorious was the fact that Robert Welch, the founder, had written that none other than President Dwight Eisenhower was a communist sympathizer. And he went even further to suggest that Eisenhower's brother was a communist, that the Dulles brothers were communists, and it went on and on. Welch was an extremely bright man, but he was overly fond of conspiracies, shall we say. So my book really is about who the real John Birch is and how and why his name was used the way it was. And would John Birch himself have been a member of the John Birch Society? Birch was an idealistic young American who went to China. Whoops, I got the wrong clicker. There we go. This is a photo of Birch as a young man at Mercer University in Macon, Georgia, where he was nominated as a Rhodes Scholar. He went from there to a small Baptist college in Fort Worth, Texas, and was sent to China, rather in July of 1940. He was full of enthusiasm for his new life in China. And from here he is with Oscar Wells, his comrade in arms. They've just arrived in Shanghai. You can see they're all dressed very nattily in their white suits, and they're holding their pith helmets and their white shoes. And this is at a time when China is already 3 years at war with Japan. but Shanghai is still removed from the war, and you would never know it from this photo that there was a war raging on. But Birch did then become much more aware of what was going on in China, and he started off in Shanghai. Then he spent about 3 months in Shanghai learning the language, went to Hangzhou as a missionary, working at a boys' school there. And then Hangzhou was occupied by the Japanese, so he decided to strike out on his own with some Chinese colleagues to Shangrao in Jiangxi Province. And there's a dramatic story of how they crossed the Japanese lines. He, despite the fact that he was a fundamentalist and evangelical Christian, he took Chinese culture very seriously. He learned the language. He learned to respect the Chinese, and he learned how to get along in Chinese culture. But after Pearl Harbor, he was quite isolated in this area of Shangrao. He wasn't getting money from the mission back home. He wasn't surviving very well. He was surviving on rice and beans and not much else. And after Pearl Harbor, he decided to volunteer for the U.S. Army. Wrote a letter to the U.S. mission in Chongqing, and they said, well, we'd be happy to have you. The Japanese enemy was advancing, and he realized that the prospects of being a Christian missionary weren't too good while the war was waging. So he said, first things first, I have to contribute to defeat the Japanese, and then I can return to being a missionary. He expected to be a military chaplain, and he said he was willing to do anything. And if the army didn't want him, then he would probably go to the northwest of China and start his own mission. So he was very independent. He was really very courageous. And he had no idea that Claire Chennault, and here's a picture of Birch a little bit later in the army. But he had no idea that Claire Chennault, the commander of the Flying Tigers in China, would recruit him as a field intelligence officer, the first of the field intelligence officers working for what became the 14th Air Force in China. Chennault was recruiting Americans who, like Birch, who knew the language, who could survive eating Chinese food, which not all Americans could at that point, who understood China. And Chennault said it was a very rugged and dangerous sort of life. Their attitude was in marked contrast to the cynical sneering over the Chinese war effort then in fashion among rear echelon staff officers. That's what Chennault wrote in his memoirs. So Birch actually did an excellent job as a field intelligence officer. After 3 years, well, he also was decorated by Chennault for his service. And one of his colleagues, a fellow named Art Hopkins, who is in the middle up here, the rogue with a pipe, they're all kind of roguish. These are all OSS members. Art Hopkins knew and worked with Birch, and he said Birch had an amazing grasp of the Chinese language, understood the people, was absolutely fearless, completely unselfish, never thinking of his personal discomfort or danger. So after 3 years in the military, frequently operating behind Japanese lines, and Birch also suffered from repeated bouts of malaria, he was elated when at long last the war was coming to an end. He was in the OSS at this point, up in Anhui Province, and he was on this base, Roger 2 Sugar, that was the radio code, R2S, and the OSS, rather than saying, okay, the war is over, you can go home now, said you need to go on one final mission up to the city of Zhejiang, right here, which is kind of midway between Shanghai and Beijing. And Birch at the time wrote to Marjorie Tooker, an American nurse who had met earlier in the war, and he said, when the first wild thrills swept through this little river town where I was last night, I realized for the first time how utterly weary, even heartsick, the war has made me. And I think the same mixture of exhaustion and excitement and relief marked the U.S. effort in general. In other words, the U.S. didn't have any stomach, and the U.S. public didn't have any heart for fighting a war in China, getting involved in a civil war. And the policy of the American government was to be as neutral as possible, recognizing that the United States had relations with the established central government, the Republic of China, the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek, the Kuomintang. So at this point in time, everything is fluid, everything is in flux, and no one can really imagine the possibility of a civil war that will result, I should say, many people can imagine that there will be a civil war. That seemed to be almost inevitable. But very, very few people could imagine that the communists would be the victors in 4 years. Marjorie Tooker, and this is a radio team that Birch led a little bit earlier in the war. Here he is, Chinese and Americans working together. Marjorie Tooker was with the Yale China Association's Xiangyao Hospital in Changsha when Birch and his radio team arrived there in 1943. And his letters to her, as I was saying to Jan earlier, really reveal someone who is very thoughtful, very tender-hearted. There's a romantic side to him. So this is in contrast to what you might think of as the dour, narrow, sort of fundamentalist missionary image. And so he shares his hopes and dreams in these letters, not only to Marjorie Tooker, but to two other women with whom he fell in love. And Marjorie Tooker later wrote, "I was much attracted to this handsome young man with his devotion to China and his burning missionary zeal, to say nothing of his charm and appealing Southern courtesy." This is a photo of Marjorie Tooker as a nurse in Changsha on the left, and then after Changsha was occupied by the Japanese, she joined the U.S. Army Nurse Corps, and there she is in her uniform on the right. And at the end of the war, she was in the Philippines, based in the Philippines, and wrote a letter to John Birch saying, "What on earth has happened to you? Mail has caught up with us, and nothing to indicate where you are." And so it's very poignant. It's very sad. John's mother, Ethel Birch, and here she is at a memorial service, Ethel and George Birch, her husband, with Frank Norris, the evangelical preacher who sent Birch out to China. And this is a memorial after the death of Birch. And John's mother was at her home in Macon, Georgia, when a young woman driving a taxi delivered a Western Union telegram. Ethel tore open the telegram, hoping to find that her son was finally coming home from China, and instead was informed that her son, Captain John M. Birch, had been killed. He was dead. And a letter from the War Department in Washington subsequently said, it confirmed his death, and it said, "The official casualty report states that your son was killed on August 25, 1945, en route to Suzhou, China, on the Longhai Railway as a result of stray bullets." Well, in fact, Birch was not killed as a result of stray bullets. It was a confrontation with a Chinese communist detachment from the 8th Route Army, the CCP's 8th Route Army. His OSS team, a team of Chinese, Koreans, and 4 Americans, including himself, had walked into an area where the communists were still fighting the Japanese. The Japanese had orders not to surrender to anybody except the nationalists. So they were fighting, active fighting was going on. The local Red Army commander had orders to detain and disarm any intruders. Birch refused. He said, "What are you, bandits? How can you think about disarming an American officer? We've just won the war. We've just dropped the atomic bomb." And the situation escalated. He was shot and killed. The communists later claimed that they had acted in self-defense. So news, and here is a photo of his burial in Zhejiang. My wife Ellen and I were able to visit Zhejiang a couple of years ago and able to visit this site. There's really not too much to be seen there, but there were 2 American airmen that were buried on either side of Birch. And just a few days ago, I received an email from the nephew of one of the other men, a P-51 pilot by the name of Samuel E. Evans. And he said, I read about your book, and I got a copy, and I noticed the name of my uncle, Samuel Evans, and can you tell me more about the burial of John Birch? So that was really quite remarkable. It sent chills up my spine. But he was accorded a rather remarkable ceremony attended by Japanese and Chinese puppet troops, puppets working for the Japanese, who were, some of them were going over to the communists at that point. It was a chaotic situation. There was a big funeral service held in a local Catholic church, which we were also able to visit. And this was all organized by a young lieutenant, an American named William Miller, who wrote about this in detail. So news about this incident was conveyed by Miller by radio telegram to General Albert Wiedemeyer. Wiedemeyer was the commander of U.S. forces in China who had succeeded Joseph Stilwell, Vinegar Joe Stilwell, and Wiedemeyer had received this top secret radio communication about the death of an American officer in North China. And the news was alarming. The United States at this point is trying to keep the lid on, trying to avoid civil war, trying to avoid being entangled in this China problem that they can see welling up. And Wiedemeyer was already concerned because another OSS team, another 4 Americans, it was called the Spaniel Mission, had been captured and detained by the communists up near Beijing 3 months earlier, in late June. And they were being held by the communists near the city of Fuping. And Wiedemeyer was quite concerned about what was going on, what was the signal, what were the communists trying to say. And now an American was killed, so was this deliberate or was it an accident? And were these men being detained, the 3 Americans that were with Birch and the others, the 4 that were further north, was this a warning to the United States not to interfere with China's internal affairs? Now that Japan had surrendered, were these actions meant to sabotage the U.S. role in brokering a peace between the nationalists and communists? Or was this simply the result of uncoordinated actions by local commanders? So, as I say, Wiedemeyer was quite concerned, but maintaining neutrality on the part of the United States would prove to be quite difficult if Americans were being captured and killed. Just 2 days before Wiedemeyer received this report, Mao Zedong was escorted from Yan'an, the communist headquarters up in Shanxi province, down to Chongqing for peace talks with Chiang Kai-shek. He had flown with Hurley on an American plane. Ambassador Hurley, this outspoken, larger-than-life, rather erratic, colorful personality, as you can see from the photo, dressed to the nines, accompanied Mao. He flew up to Yan'an to bring Mao down to Chongqing. And this was Mao's first time in his life on an airplane. And you can sort of see the shock on Mao's face. So he looks a little like a deer that's been caught in the headlight. So it's a remarkable point in time. And Wiedemeyer requests a meeting, an urgent meeting with Mao and with Zhou Enlai, who also happens to be in Chongqing at that time. And so on the evening of August 30, this is just 5 days after the death of Birch, after he's been shot, Wiedemeyer has a conversation with Mao and Zhou. And he informs the communist leaders, he points to a map, and he informs them, and here is Mao and Chiang Kai-shek. Mao, interestingly, and I think significantly, stays in Chongqing for 43 days. So this was not just for show. It wasn't just a photo op, right? He wasn't just in and out of Chongqing. He stayed there, isolated from his own forces, while this land grab is going on in the north of China for 43 days. Why? Well, it's because the communists at this point don't believe that they have enough strength to go into a civil war and win, and they aren't at all sure what position the Soviet Union, Stalin, would take, because at this point Stalin recognizes the nationalists, Chiang Kai-shek, as the legitimate government. So this is a period of great uncertainty, great questions sort of swirling around. So Wiedemeyer shows the map of North China and explains that Birch has been killed in this town. Birch and his team had made their way up by foot and by boat and then finally by rail to this little town of Huangkou, 30 miles to the west of Zhejiang. The dashed line is the route taken by the 3 Americans who survived and the Chinese and Koreans who were with them as well. It took them 2 months to go from Huangkou back all the way to Yan'an, and then they were flown out very quickly from Yan'an back to Chongqing and back to the United States. And they write about their experience in detail, but they spent this 2 months, the first part of the journey, almost, 7 weeks or 8 weeks by foot, and then this last leg they were able to fly. So Wiedemeyer says, and this is a quote from the transcript in the National Archives, the declassified files of the OSS and the National Archives in Washington. And Wiedemeyer says, he describes this incident, the death of Birch, as a very serious and grave incident. And Zhou Enlai says, why was he there? Wiedemeyer says, he was sent there by me to obtain information about the Japanese. I feel I can and must send Americans anywhere in China to carry out my mission. You mean any place? Asked Zhou. Yes, says Wiedemeyer. And Mao seems to be caught by surprise. And Mao says, if it's true that the communist troops shot this American officer, then I extend my deepest sympathy, my deepest apology. I will investigate this incident and also hope that from now on, anyone going into those areas where communist troops are operating, that they notify the communist troops beforehand so as to avoid unnecessary incidents. So both sides didn't want these things to blow out of proportion. Wiedemeyer then says, well, prior notification of US military movements is not always feasible. I says, I can and I must be able to send troops anywhere, anytime. And Mao assures Wiedemeyer that the communists have welcomed the Americans as friends. He says, we only have one enemy, and that is Japan, even though the war is just over. And then Mao and Zhou both point out the fact that the communists have helped to rescue scores of American flyers, downed American flyers, which was indeed the case. So you can see in this this confrontation, this heated conversation, that the way in which it underscores the issue of sovereignty and territorial integrity, nationalism, if you will. Mao was polite and apologized in the course of this conversation, but we've learned from other records that privately, as you might imagine, he was furious. he was furious. Wiedemeyer had treated him like a schoolboy, had lectured him, and Mao was understandably very angry. Nonetheless, the communists, shortly after this incident, reversed their policy of intercepting and detaining Americans, and they say, be very, very careful with any Americans coming into territory that you held. So it's quite a revealing incident. The death of Birch would have been relegated to historical footnotes had it not been for Senator William Knowland, who was sometimes called Senator from Formosa, because he was such an outspoken advocate for the nationalists in Chiang Kai-shek. He was an influential senator. He wasn't I won't name any names of contemporary politicians to make parallels, especially people running for office. But after the outbreak of the Korean War, he got up on the floor of the US Senate and he said, I'm going to tell you the simple story of a lone American officer who was willing to sacrifice his life so that this nation might find out whether the communists were friends or enemies. And he goes on to say, had the American Congress and the American people only known the story of Captain John Birch, killed in cold blood by the Chinese who were supposed to be allies, history would have been different. That is to say, the Americans would have known, the American people, American Congress, American leaders would have known what communism was really all about, overlooking the fact that the communists and the Americans were working together at this point in 1945 when Birch is killed. So he calls Birch the first casualty of World War III, that is the Cold War, the first casualty of World War III. In many ways, of course, Birch really is one of the last casualties, one of the final casualties of World War II. A man named Robert Welch, who had been interested in politics even though, as he was a businessman with his brothers selling candy, the James A. Welch Company, if you've ever had pom-poms or sugar daddies or other confectionaries. And by the way, the Welch Candy Company is not to be confused with Welch grape juice. Thomas Welch and Robert and James Welch are two different people. But Robert Welch read Knowland's speech. It didn't get much attention at the time. The Korean War is on, all kinds of American casualties in Korea, so who cares about this obscure event back in 1945? I mean, it's clear now in 1945 that 1950, the Korean War, that the communists are enemies, and the Chinese are about to enter Korea. In fact, but Robert Welch reads the speech in the Congressional Record three years later and decides that John Birch is going to be the ideal symbol for a new movement, a new advocacy group. Not only was Birch a heroic young man who recognized the dangers of communism long before others, but there had been a cover-up of his death. So this plays into Welch's belief that basically everything is conspiracy. And this was evidence not of conspiracy from abroad, but within the US government itself. Welch said that Birch's death showed it was a deliberate and unjustified killing. He claimed that Birch had sacrificed his life as a warning to others about the true intentions of the communists. And as Welch put it, with his death and in his death, the battle lines are drawn, and only one system could emerge victorious. And this was an illustration produced by the Birch Society some years later, depicting Birch as a martyr, a missionary soldier who was a martyr. So Robert Welch, who never met Birch and never went to China, although he did later visit Taiwan, wrote a short biography about John Birch in 1954, and with the enthusiastic support of Birch's parents, Ethel and George Birch. He used the name of John Birch for his new organization, the John Birch Society, which was not founded until late 1958. And the Birch Society became, interestingly, I think, one of the largest and most influential conservative organizations of its time, even though it was so controversial. A lot of middle-class, white suburban Americans became members of the Birch Society for reasons that we could talk about. So this book really is a story about a young American who went to China to save China as a Christian missionary. He endeavored to defend China as a military intelligence officer, and that is the story of how his life was used to express fear of China during the Cold War. Birch had no particular sympathy either for the nationalists or the communists. His sympathies, his loyalties lay with the Chinese people. He didn't believe there was actually any such entity as China. China was still chaotic. It's still not unified at this point in time. So he wasn't interested at all in politics. He wanted to go off and strike out on his own. So he had no intention of becoming a political martyr. He had no interest, I think, in representing the kind of conspiracy that Robert Welch described. And I think in many ways this is a story about how his identity was stolen from him. It was misappropriated and misused. And so Birch himself, as I write in the book, became a mirage, becomes a cipher. In some ways, it parallels the American dream for China, which is always shimmering in the distance, always just out of reach.
Okay, thank you, Terry. That's I have lots of questions that come from having read the book and wanting to know more details about some of these things, but I want to open it up to everyone else. But let me just start with something that you talked about at the very end, that Birch himself would not have wanted this kind of misappropriation of his life, of his beliefs, and mainly of his name, because you probably scratch most members of the Birch Society now or in the past, even when it was strong, and they wouldn't have had a clue about his life and what he was really doing and who he was. And in reading the book, I was struck by how much actually his own family, and particularly his mother, was involved in making her son, making their, and I don't know what I know you talked to all three brothers, you tracked down three of his brothers who are still alive, and so I'm curious your take on the mother and then what the brothers had to say about that and how they felt about his life and name being misappropriated.
Yeah, thank you. Ethel Birch, John's mother, he was the oldest of the children, and she adored him. She loved him deeply, and so the death came as a horrible shock. And she tried to investigate the details. She wanted herself to write a book about her son and what he had been doing in China. It wasn't easy because working for the 14th Air Force Intelligence and then for the OSS, a lot of his work was secret. He wasn't able to write about it in his letters home in any kind of detail. But she went out and started interviewing people who had known him in China, and she collected letters and interviews. She interviewed Claire Chennault, General Chennault, everybody. She interviewed Wiedemeyer. She never was able to get around to writing her own book, but it was on the basis of material that she collected that Robert Welch wrote his little biography, which was really more his own political platform. But Ethel Birch was frustrated by the U.S. authorities in being able to get any kind of detailed information about the circumstances of her son's death. The report on his death remained classified until shortly after Nixon's trip to China in 1972. In fact, it was delayed until a little after Nixon's visit, so it wouldn't cause any embarrassment. And because it was classified, no one could really say, or there were very few people who could say for sure what had happened and who was responsible. And so that was and there were good reasons for that, I think, because governments don't typically release classified documents very easily or willingly, as we've seen from WikiLeaks and so forth. And this was also a very delicate period in U.S.-China relations, and so this is another reason why the government didn't want to release these documents sooner. And then, thirdly, the circumstances of Birch's death were embarrassing. The report concluded that Birch, to some extent, the killing was unjustified, that the communists were responsible for murder, but that Birch, because he had lost his temper, and I argue in my book that he was suffering from post-traumatic stress. He was at the end of his rope. The circumstances of the death were embarrassing, and so the government was not anxious to make all of this public.
Embarrassing in that he had brought it on himself
Exactly.
with his
So the conclusion was,
confrontational
yeah,
actions.
he had lost his temper. He'd been provocative, and so he bore at least some responsibility, even though, as I say, at the end it was classified as a murder and it was unjustified. As you have to remember, late 40s, early 50s, as Ethel is trying to find out what really happened, this is when Cold War is at its height, and there's a great deal of paranoia and real concern about the fact that the Soviet Union has acquired the bomb. That there are spies in the United States that are assisting them to do that, and so forth. And so Ethel, I think, is convinced not only that there's been a cover-up of what actually happened to her son, but so she's also hugely frustrated by the fact that he is not eligible. He's not been awarded anything more than the Legion of Merit, which he received from Chennault. And this is Welch with a portrait of Birch in his office in Belmont, Massachusetts. But she's frustrated by the fact that even with Senator Knowland's assistance, he is not eligible for even a Purple Heart, because at that time the communists were not enemies. And so she becomes quite angry. And she writes a letter saying, "I'm not a Republican. I've always voted for Democrats, but I think there's something amiss. There's something really wrong with what's going on." So when Robert Welch came along and he said, "I want to do for your son what the U.S. government, the U.S. military has been unable to do," she's willing to do that. And I think even though she might have been uncomfortable with some of the philosophy, some of the ideology of Robert Welch, some of the things that he said about Eisenhower and so forth, she and her husband were never willing to disavow the Birch Society, because I think to do that would have been tantamount to disavowing their own son, right? So she never breaks with the Birch Society, and they remain loyal, lifelong members to the end of their lives. The three brothers who are surviving, still alive, their late 80s, early 90s, were very generous in giving me access to letters and speaking about their memories. They're really lovely people. One of them had been a member of the Birch Society, but then he resigned. And I think they all, in one way or another, said to me, John was not interested in politics. He was interested in remaining in China as a missionary. His interest really was in religion. And you have to remember, this is a time in American life when religion and politics are on separate tracks. It's not until the late 70s into the 80s that those lines begin to cross, and we begin to see social conservatives, religious conservatives who become more politically active. But at this earlier period where the Birch Society is active, and John Birch himself through the 30s, you don't see so much of a connection.
And you say he's interested in his religion, but I was also struck by reading the book that he was interested in the sort of evangelical part of his religion. He was interested in saving souls. So he was much less interested in his parents, who were also missionaries and had spent time, were not happy with some of the missionary work they were doing because it focused too much on growing food and hospitals, teaching someone how to fish rather than saving their soul, kind of thing.
Right.
And
this was always a tension within the missionary movement. Do you kind of go to the immediate issue of trying to, rescue somebody's, for eternal life, if you will, or do you think about, feeding them? And Birch was involved in some relief efforts when he was in Hangzhou earlier on, but he was, because of his upbringing, because of his parents, who were not just Baptists, but were independent Baptists, so they were straight and narrow. They believed in a literal interpretation of the Bible. But what you see in Birch, particularly after he joins the military, is I think a steady maturing in his views, an appreciation of the fact, for example, that even Catholics could be Christians. And just a wider understanding of the world that he had not been exposed to at that point. Being in the military like that in a time of war, and remember Birch was constantly behind lines and really in dangerous situations even though he wasn't in combat, you grow up very quickly. I spent a year in Vietnam. I was not in combat, but I think I was in my early 20s, and I think I grew up a whole lot during that year, as anybody would. And so you see Birch, questioning, beginning to have doubts about some of these straight and narrow beliefs that he's grown up with, and confessing to Marjorie Tooker, maybe they are too introspective, the two of them, and maybe they analyze things too much, and maybe that's because of the way they've been brought up. And he's a smart guy. He's a very intelligent man. So you can see through his letters and through his interactions with other people who were really drawn to him, whether they were Christians or not. A number of people said they may not have shared his religious beliefs, but they respected him because he was so consistent in his beliefs, because he was so steadfast, he was so courageous. And some people did criticize him for being headstrong, particularly people in the OSS, which is another story.
I will open it up, but just one comment I want to make. You talked about how much his mother loved him. He was the oldest of her children, the firstborn, but that was certainly reciprocated.
Oh, absolutely.
He adored his mother, thought with the women, which I hope we'll get to in some of your questions. If not, I'll ask about the women. But he always told anyone that was interested that his mother was the most amazing, wonderful woman. And that you, in the book, Terry talks a little bit about the mother and father before they even were married, and it's clear that she was the dominant person in the relationship between the two parents, and that she was extraordinarily energetic and dedicated person.
She was the one who raised these 7 children. The father was not always around, and the 3 brothers who I was able to meet, they lived in Georgia and Tennessee. They worshipped her, they adored her, they thought she just could do about anything, and she really could. She was a remarkably strong, enterprising, energetic, intelligent woman. She had gone to the College of Worcester in Ohio and aspired to be a medical doctor, a medical missionary. That didn't happen. But she could have done anything.
Okay, Bill, will you introduce yourself?
Sure. Bill Armbruster, retired journalist. Known you since Taiwan days in the early 70s. First of all, does the John Birch Society still exist?
Yes, it does, and it's you can find it online. They moved from Belmont, Massachusetts after the death of Robert Welch some years ago to Appleton, Wisconsin. Coincidentally, it's the home of none other than Joseph McCarthy.
And you said, who were the two Americans that he was buried next to?
Yes, one was an airman. In fact, both were airmen. One was named Samuel Evans. And the other, I have not been able to locate his name. I'm still working on that. They were buried on either side of Birch's.
But they were not part of the mission.
No, they were not. They died in crashes in the area, in the Suzhou area. And I know, well, Birch's mother declined to have his remains returned to the United States. That was an option. She was asked. And she said, no, I would really prefer to leave his remains in China because he always wanted to stay in China. He'd written to her about this. He wanted to stay in China as a missionary. He loved China. I think he did. Respect and admire the Chinese people, Chinese culture. And so she left him there. And I learned just recently, as I mentioned, from the nephew of Samuel Evans, that his family decided to leave his remains. What happened to those remains when we visited Suzhou, we were unable to find out. We were unable to get into the archives. We did meet with some Chinese. In fact, one Chinese medical doctor who was 10 years old in 1945, who said, I was there at the burial ceremony. My father was a Chinese Presbyterian minister, and he knew exactly where it was. He took us right there on the first morning we were in Suzhou, and he said, "This is the location." But nobody could tell us what had happened. My strong suspicion is that the remains were removed, probably during even earlier during the Korean War, when there were widespread anti-American campaigns.
Okay, Mara.
Okay. I'm Mara Cunningham. I work here at the National Committee, and I'm also a historian, so I have a question about sources and process. So it sounds like you owe a lot to John Birch's mother collecting all these letters and saving them and assembling a little archive. Did you know about that before you started working on this, or would you have been able to do this book without having access to those sources?
I
And what else
had
did you
no
use?
clue that
Okay.
there were such letters.
Right.
I didn't know anything about the love letters that he'd written to these three women. One trove of letters from Marjorie Tooker I discovered at Yale Divinity School.
Mm-hmm.
A second batch of letters Ellen and I discovered when we were meeting with another one of the brothers in North Carolina. And we were having a conversation with them about John Birch, and I said, you know, there was this Scottish nurse he fell in love with. Her name was Audrey Mayer. Do you happen to know anything about that? And so the wife of the brother, Douglas Birch, got up and went over to a trunk and opened it up, and she said, I think we've got letters that John wrote to Audrey. This is the woman he was engaged to, and she had this stack of letters, and my mouth dropped open. And I said, do you mind if I take photographs and make copies of this? And they were very, very generous in that. Some copies of her letters, most of them, but not all, were in possession of the brother, but then she had made copies and sent copies of many of the letters that she had, and interviews and letters that she'd received from others who knew her son. She had sent those to William Knowland. And so there were copies of those that I found in Knowland's papers at Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley archives. And then there were letters that he had written to the newspaper that Frank Norris, this charismatic evangelical preacher in Fort Worth, Texas, who had sent Birch out to China. Norris portrayed Birch as a hero and was eager to publish any information about Birch. So I went down to tiny little Arlington Baptist Missionary College, Baptist Bible College in Arlington, Texas, and they have a little archive there, and they have all the copies of the newspaper called The Fundamentalist. And in the pages of The Fundamentalist, lo and behold, here were these stories and actual letters from John Birch, particularly a letter that I hadn't seen anywhere else about the journey that he made from Hangzhou across Japanese lines to Shangrao.
And there was also the interview by the Air Force.
Well, that was another revelation. We went down to the 14th Air Force Archives in Montgomery, Alabama. And Ellen went off to tour the local museums and the Civil Rights Museum. And I was wading through files thought might be relevant to the time and the place where Birch was in China at this time. And I think it was my second day, I just stopped dead in my tracks because here was a 24-page oral history interview that the Air Force Historical Office had done with John Birch about 4 months before his death. And they interviewed him because he was the first intelligence officer who had done this kind of work. He had done some very dramatic experiences. He, before he joined the Army, had met Jimmy Doolittle, I think I mentioned, in Zhejiang Province, and had assisted them. Frank Norris and later Robert Welch said that Birch was responsible for rescuing Doolittle and the Doolittle Raiders. That was very far-fetched. Birch never would have made that claim. He was far too modest to have made that claim. But others, and Welch in particular, inflated his biography for obvious reasons.
Hi, my name is Guy Martin, and I'm curious if during the Chinese Civil War or afterwards, the Chinese nationalists tried to repurpose his memory or use John Birch for their own gains.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and he did receive some military honors, some awards from the nationalists. They, I think, were eager to agree that the communists had murdered him in cold blood, but they did not make a big issue out of it. They were asked by the Americans to investigate from their sources what had happened. There were telegrams sent from the headquarters in Suzhou, where the nationalists were just getting themselves established, back to Chiang Kai-shek about the murder of Birch, so it did get some attention at the highest level. But I think that there was so much going on at this time. This is such a chaotic period of time, and so much in flux, that it wasn't something that they decided to focus on. And I think the main reason for that is they knew full well that Wedemeyer had made an issue of this with Mao and Zhou Enlai, and I think they realized that it was in their best interest to try to keep this fairly quiet and not to turn it into a cause of war. But it's a good question.
Terry, I'm curious, what does his intelligence work?
Mary Helen Hendricks.
I'm curious, what did his intelligence work composed of, and whether or not there's any possibility that work had any kind of contaminating or effect on his death, or had any relation to his death?
Another really good question. He was responsible for managing Chinese agents in the field, He had radio intelligence networks that had been set up across pretty wide areas. He assisted working with both the nationalists and the communists, depending on where he was, with the rescue of downed American pilots. He provided weather reports. Weather reports in this day and age, where you didn't have Google and satellites and all of that, were really critical because the weather pattern, 100 miles away, 200 miles away, could be very different. And so this was extremely important for the Americans, flying their missions. And he was also gathering whatever information he or his teams or his agents could on the movements of Japanese troops, that kind of information. So as I say, there was, particularly when he moved up to Anhui Province in North China, there was coordination, there was some interaction with the communists. There was no love lost for the communists, but there was one of Birch's commanding officers in the OSS. So Birch was very pragmatic about the communists. He said if they were willing to work to fight the Japanese, then he was all for it, right? So he wasn't an ideologue that, like you might imagine. There has been the argument that because he was an intelligence officer and because he was knowledgeable, that this did contribute to his death. There is an author of really a very well-researched book on the history of the OSS in China who makes this argument, but I think it doesn't hold up because Birch was a low-level officer. There was no particular gain for the communists in intercepting him and getting rid of him. And so I don't think the argument holds up. I go into that in more detail in the book.
Frank?
First of all, Terry, Frank Kale, United States-China Exchanges. You tell a wonderful story, Terry. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just wanted to mention a personal note on my encounter with the John Birch Society regarding China. After my wife and I came back from China in 1971, having met Zhou Enlai and two of the Gang of Four, we, with the Committee of Concerned Asian Scholars, wrote a book published by Bantam, and as happens with these books, Bantam arranged for speaking tours all around. One of the first was at Vassar College, and it would have been just about January, February, if my memory goes, which is to say just before the Nixon visit in '72. And we were protested. And the people who were protesting us, both before our talk and as the audience exited our talk, were people from the John Birch Society. There were, I think, 4 or 5, and I think I still have 2 posters that they held, which are in mini storage. Unfortunately, I have forgotten the content, but I can find it.
I'd love to see that. Thanks.
Peggy Blumenthal, Institute of International Education. So this picks up on that a little bit. You dropped a little nugget about why were white suburban women all members, and so some of those were Vassar girls. What's the story? What's the attraction?
Yeah,
Right.
and even if you say the majority of Birch members were women.
Significant number. Yeah,
right.
yeah. I think this comes at a time when a lot of Americans are concerned about Cold War, but Robert Welch was very effective in marketing. He knew how to sell candy. And selling politics in some ways is not all that different. It's a marketable good. And what Welch was able to do that Joseph McCarthy did not do was to get down to the retail level. McCarthy was a wholesaler, right, by way of the media. But Robert Welch organized chapters. Some people describe these as cells, you know, a la the Chinese the Communist Party, right? But these were small groups, and they would meet at least once a month. Welch was prolific, put out, you know, he had his own magazine, had all kinds of literature. You know, there was no end of information and material. And he had this way of compiling fact upon fact upon fact to sort of be very convincing and very compelling. At the same time, if you listen to his speeches, which you can find online, he's incredibly boring. He's very dry, but he's a very bright guy. And so I think these, what appeared to be logical, compelling arguments, the camaraderie, or the sense of sharing an interest, a concern, you know, being able as a citizen to stand up and pledge allegiance to the flag, which you would do at the opening of every Birch Society meeting, and then to talk about world events. This is before organizations like World Affairs Council and so forth, Foreign Affairs groups. You know, this, I think, satisfied a need that was out there. So it was a combination of the message and the organization. And it was particularly popular, particularly effective in Southern California, Texas, some of the other Western states, even though the Birch Society was based in Massachusetts, in Belmont, Massachusetts.
Hi, Tom Grunfeld, Empire State College. Perhaps it should be mentioned that one of the people with Welch who founded this was the Koch brothers' father.
Yes.
But what I wanted to ask you,
Fred Koch.
Fred Koch, yeah.
Yeah.
So what I wanted to ask you though is that not long after this was formed, this is in line with this appeal to women, but not long after, William Buckley in National Review excoriated John Birch Society, said they weren't conservative, they were radical, and I wonder if you know what the consequences were for the John Birch Society after that.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're absolutely right. Buckley, who was an up-and-coming conservative, saw Welch after he had come out and said, after it came out that he had said that Eisenhower was a communist. Buckley said, this is just going too far, and if we allow this to happen, the whole conservative movement will be affected. So he said, if we are responsible conservatives, and he said this to Barry Goldwater at a meeting in Palm Beach, West Palm Beach, Florida, he said, if we don't read this guy out of the conservative movement, we might be in trouble. So Welch was attacked from both the left and the right. And I was able to, with the agreement of Christopher Buckley, William Buckley's son, I was able to look at Buckley's papers on all of this. But Welch said that they gained as many new members as they lost as a consequence of this. The number of Birch Society members at its height may have been as many as 100,000. It wasn't that large. It wasn't
And
that
its height was when?
early 60s, very early 60s. But they were effective in advertising. They had letter writing campaigns. You know, writing to your congressman. They had campaigns to infiltrate the local PTA, to protest books in your public library that were, that showed evidence of socialist or communist leanings, and so that's why all these satires come out. But the Birch Society did survive. I think the collapse of the Goldwater bid for the presidency really marked the eclipse of the Birch Society. That was the beginning of not the end, but it no longer had the voice it did, number one. Number two, late 60s with the civil rights movement, the civil rights protests, the Vietnam War protests, you see far more radicalism on both the left and the right, and willingness to use violence. The Birch Society never preached violence. They preached anti-big government, strict interpretation of the Constitution. Does it sound familiar? So you can, and there are scholars who draw a line between this early conservative message and today's contemporary Tea Party.
Well, on that note that brings it up to date, which I was hoping we would be able to do, we've reached the witching hour. We try to let people go exactly at 7, but we hope that many of you will buy the book, which is on sale right outside, and Terry will be happy to sit here and sign your copies for you. So join me in